Hi, I'm Eric Schlenker-Goodrich. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Environmental Law Center based here in Taos. Thank you everybody for showing up. Really a pleasure to see a lot of familiar faces in the room. Great big thanks to the Harwood Museum for providing this fabulous venue and co-sponsoring this, as well as with Amigos Bravos. Joe, where are you? Joe. For folks who haven't met, Joe Zupan, the new executive director of Amigos Bravos. So he's here. Rachel Kahn, the projects director with Amigos Bravos, and Shannon Romeline, also with Amigos Bravos. And then WELC staff, very briefly, thank you, Dina, for managing all the logistics for this event. And then Kyle Tisdale, an attorney in our Taos office and also director of our climate and energy program, and Brian Sweeney, our communications director. So thank you for everybody who helped co-sponsor and put this event together. It's a great privilege and honor to have Jim Furnish with us today. Jim has a long storied career with the United States Forest Service. He worked his ranks up, I believe, from a ranger, including on the San Juan National Forest up in southern Colorado, forest supervisor in the Siuslaw National Forest in Oregon, and then also deputy chief of the Forest Service in Washington, D.C. during some very exciting times in the late 1990s. Jim is also the author of a great book right here, Toward a Natural Forest, and he's going to give some readings from his book and some reflections of his work and life with the Forest Service and the future of where our national forests are going. We'll then show a short film. Jim will come up again, give a few more readings, and then we'll have a panel discussion with Jim and then with Bill DuBois, who I doubt needs any real introduction here, but a fantastic storyteller and writer. And we're also pleased to have James Duran, the Carson National Forest supervisor. And for anybody who lives in Taos, as you all know, our forests are our backyard. I mean, they are critical to our life here. They are places where we hunt, where we fish, where we camp and bike. They are also places that provide us with clean water. They provide us with clean air. They provide us with firewood for a lot of our families. Grazing occurs on our forests. So forests are essential to our livelihood, our way of life here, and critical to our future, and in danger as well from a variety of threats, in particular climate change. So with that, I will sit and I will let Jim read from his book. Thank you all.
Well, I would like to take you back in time to when I started my career as a young man. My first job was in the state of Maine, and I arrived there a very bitter man. I had spent a lot of my youth traipsing around with my dad, who was a geologist in the western U.S., and after forestry school, I had my heart set on working in one of the western U.S. great national forests, and the only offer I got to work was in Maine. Now, let that be a lesson to you. Don't be bitter about your work, because I came to love Maine. I've been back many times, and it continues to impress me as a very unique and special state. But after working there for a few years, I came back to the Black Hills of South Dakota, worked there for a few years, and then had a brief assignment down in Colorado. And so that's where I began. I chose to spend our U.S. bicentennial, July 4th, 1976, backpacking Colorado's Never Summer Mountains, which form Rocky Mountain National Park's western border. Remnant ice at midsummer on Lake of the Clouds was a reminder of the long winters and brief summers in the high peaks. The lake's cobalt waters slowly emerged from a long slumber, with an ice shelf hugging the western shore. As I ambled through the alpine high country, enjoying the freedom of being small in big country, a faint tinkling sound caught my ear. I approached the margin where open water and ice met and discovered the source of the sound. Waves from an afternoon breeze roughening the water lapped against the edge of the ice, gently separating long daggers that danced and bumped in the water. Each icicle a chime now. They numbered in the thousands. From the waters emanated a sublime symphony of tinkling bells, delicate and exquisite. Winter lost its grip, and the ice did too, breaking up as it slowly disappeared. But the loss of ice was accompanied by the gain of something beautiful. With nature, this miracle of death and rebirth happens every year, part of nature's cycle, comforting in its regularity. Human endeavors also confront change, but are often accompanied with grief and stress instead of comfort. And so it was with the breakup of the U.S. Forest Service's old order. By the late 1960s, the Forest Service was engaged in a battle for the soul of public lands and a decades-long slow-motion collision with a robust and rising environmental movement. Tonight you'll hear some of the story of this breakup from the inside out through my beloved Forest Service, which, stewarding a natural world toward with the best of intentions, managed wildness unto submission and perhaps death. And I'll also give you my take of the message I heard in the symphony of landscapes that speaks to us all. The Forest Service has been hard at work for over 100 years, but it entered the 21st century a more humble agency, distrusted, even vilified by an emergent environmental constituency that saw little evidence that public lands were being managed honorably. For more traditional allies and many agency employees, the Forest Service just seemed to have lost its way. The once pleasant atmosphere in almost every Forest Service office, a product of doing God's good work, had been replaced by a nervous wariness. Rangers no longer felt appreciated, comfortable, or secure. And sadly, as events unfolded in the latter 20th century, the Forest Service lost the public's high regard. It failed to embrace progressive environmental values, which broadened and deepened into a global phenomenon. The Forest Service became a target for the environmental community and stood accused of selling out to commercial interests and squandering its legitimacy as a conservation leader. Tragic and generally true. The famed ecologist Aldo Leopold, who owns deep roots in your New Mexico, contended ultimately that we are part of our environment and must behave as biotic citizens. This in turn yields a land ethic that sees land not as a mere soil to produce commercial crops, but as a biota of which we are an integral part, to be managed as a natural environment, not an artificial one. Ultimately, this is the challenge for the Forest Service and more broadly for all natural resource managers. Now, before we watch the video, I want to share with you a brief context for what you're about to see. This video is about the Pacific Northwest, and I would caution you against dismissing it as not relevant. I think if you'll broaden your perceptions when you watch the video, you'll be able to take home a lot of messages that also have resonance here in northern New Mexico. But I want to tell you about how the ground shook when I moved to in the Oregon coast in December of 1991. The Siuslaw National Forest had just completed a 10-year effort, their first forest plan. The ink was barely dry on that plan when Judge William Dwyer, who is a federal district judge in Seattle, issued a landmark opinion on a spotted owl lawsuit. The outcome of that was that he enjoined the Forest Service from harvesting timber that was spotted owl habitat all throughout Washington, Oregon, and northern California. That was in late 1991. Almost the moment I arrived, this injunction became part of my work life. Bill Clinton came to Oregon in 1992, campaigning heavily because Oregon was a swing state. And he was promising people all throughout Oregon that he would solve the spotted owl crisis if elected. He was elected in November of 1992, inaugurated January 1993. Almost immediately, he convened a one-day forest conference in Portland in March or April of 1993. And think about this. He convened almost his entire cabinet to come to Oregon to talk about forestry. And then, in a move that left many Forest Service people aghast, he said, you guys in the Forest Service and BLM, you're going to come up with a plan in 90 days to solve this. Well, they did. And so that draft plan was issued in mid-1993. And I remember my first look at that plan, once I got past the enormity of it, when I actually started leafing through and digesting it, it was clear that a new world was dawning for forest management in the Pacific Northwest. The outcome for this particular national forest that you're going to see chronicled here was that the Siuslaw had been happily logging about 350 million board feet a year. That's a lot. On a very small national forest that's about the same size as many big ranger districts in New Mexico. The new plan slimmed that down from 350 million to 215 million. Still a lot of logging. The Northwest Forest Plan said the Siuslaw National Forest will now produce 7 million board feet. So we had gone from 350 million board feet to 7 in the space of about 3 years. This had dire consequences for society, for communities, for the agency itself. It was just a crisis. Little has actually been shown about, well, okay, what happened then? And so we really tried to depict the story, which we think is a very hopeful, successful story of life after the crisis. And so let's show the video. You know, I spent a lot of time with Alan Hoenick, the producer of that video, and one of the things I love doing is calling him after one of these events and sharing with him how people appreciated this story. It means a lot to him. In 2005, the Forest Service produced The Greatest Good, a movie of the agency's first century. Have many of you seen that? The Greatest Good? Okay, got around a little bit. It's actually quite good. I found the movie authentic. It genuinely, respectfully captured the essence of the agency of my experience. Orville Daniels, the former supervisor of the Lolo National Forest in Missoula, Montana, rightly noted in the video that the Forest Service went over to the dark side in its pursuit of timber. And I squirm at the truth of that pithy reflection because I too went there for a while. I wanted to take you back and share an anecdote of my first summer as a sophomore in college when I got a timber job on the Umpqua National Forest in the Oregon Cascades. And when I arrived in Tiller, Oregon, for my first job, I met my boss for the summer, Owen Downhill Jr. Yeah, Owen Downhill Jr. He lived in a small house on the Forest Service compound with his wife and young children, and Owen very graciously cared for us, his young, inexperienced crew, while we learned the ropes. I had no car, so I walked around town to the two big attractions, Ruth Mount's 42 Cafe and Porter's Grocery Store / post office. Well, Owen knew that I loved to fish. So one day he took me to Squaw Creek, one of his favorite spots. Early on a Saturday, we followed the Umpqua River up to its confluence with Jackson Creek. And then passing near the world's largest sugar pine, we took a logging road a few miles farther southeast, heading higher into the mountains. We parked on the shoulder of the road in a fresh, clear-cut harvest. Heading straight downhill, crazy steep, we followed a crude fire break built by a dozer. Charred logs lay scattered about from when the Forest Service burned the clear-cut to get rid of logging debris so the site could be planted more easily with fir seedlings. It was sunny, and it was hot. We quickly reached Squaw Creek, no more than 10 feet wide, running down through giant trees, a never-ending series of crystal-clear pools amid the boulder-strewn channel. Native cutthroat trout awaited us. Lost in reverie, we fished for hours, leapfrogging our way slowly in a gentlemanly fashion, making small talk. We caught and released 7 to 11-inch trout, too numerous to count, each one beautiful, and in a humans as novelty way, quick to grab even the most sloppily presented fly. What a great day. Well, we sweated buckets on the trudge uphill to the car, a small price to pay. Now, 30 years later, in the mid-90s, I met Jeff Dose, a fisheries biologist on the Umpqua National Forest. Jeff got crosswise with his boss because he'd gone rogue, speaking openly and publicly of his view that timber harvesting ruined stream health and fisheries. This earned him much scorn from agency regulars and kudos from the environmental community who knew there was abundant evidence of environmental trouble if they could only find it. Dose's outspokenness fueled suspicions that plenty more dirt lay in unseen corners. I thought Jeff had guts. Well, curious about the cutthroat trout in Squaw Creek, I approached him and I shared my recollections of fishing there in 1965. Jeff listened to me intently and then said, glum-faced, "They're all gone now." Well, I sought some reassurance, and maybe he misunderstood which creek I meant, and maybe I misunderstood him somehow. So I pressed the point that this particular Squaw Creek was the one that emptied into Jackson Creek, and he stopped and he said, "I know the one. They're all gone." Well, I begged for some explanation. How could it be that in only 30 years the cutthroat trout population had gone from abundant to zero? These trout once lent testimony to a healthy, vibrant ecosystem, and how could their loss be seen as anything but tragic? Jeff said the cumulative effect of decades of heavy logging, including, no doubt, some timber sales that I worked on, along with recreational fishing in estuaries that pounded the sea-run cutthroat, adults, and the other usual culprit, fish hatchery practices, all this had rubbed out the natives. This was the dark side that Orville Daniels spoke of. The Forest Service refused to conscientiously wrestle with this profound truth that a significant segment of the public we'd sworn to serve had rejected our management of their public lands. And the land itself was telling us of its distress. The Forest Service tweaked a few things, but the fundamental approach remained unchanged. In the realm of human interaction with the environment, we are clamoring for sustainable conservation models that maintain forests while supplying vital human needs. Herein lays a tremendous opportunity and challenge for the Forest Service. The agency has a sizable and diverse land resource to manage, an ecologically oriented mission, excellent research capacity for technology transfer, and a workforce of thousands of the world's best and most dedicated professionals, providentially positioned to provide an effective model of land management. It is the essence of the agency's mission. The key challenge is that the Forest Service has not yet embraced a land ethic capable of securing a more desirable future. I think it's past time to drive a stake in the ground and to declare a future the agency aspires to. I believe in the value of taking a stand. The transition of our public forests to timber production after World War II was a policy choice, enabled and led by the Forest Service, who can now make a similar policy pivot to manage public lands primarily for diverse habitats, clean water, restoration, carbon stores, and other environmental values, while still producing wood products sustainably. As simply as I can put it, this means managing toward a more natural forest. We need not choose between taking it all and leaving it all. Rampant exploitation for transitory profit operates at the extreme economic end of the spectrum, while preservation and exclusion of humans, with no utilization of resources whatever, operates at the ecological extreme. A middle ground does exist where fundamental stewardship humbly, modestly, and sustainably utilizes what is produced and provided by nature. These beneficial and essential environmental services can be enjoyed in perpetuity as long as we do not irreparably damage our forests, soils, and water. Let's recall that the conservation movement and the Forest Service itself were born from intentional, principled leadership in the persons of Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, the first Forest Service chief. The problem now, as I see it, is that the Forest Service's intentions for the next century and beyond are unclear. Leaders of the Forest Service have the latitude and authority to create change, That's what society expects of leaders. I say, don't squander the privilege and responsibility of leadership. Make a choice, embrace it enthusiastically, commit fully to creating a new reality and paradigm. The finest tradition of American excellence calls for us to initiate change when conditions warrant, and then to take bold action. And the world awaits leaders to step out without apology to create a different future, creating hope again and again and again. To the Forest Service I served and loved and left, I implore you, do it now. Okay, so thank you for indulging me. You've heard enough. We're going to get started with the panel. Eric, why don't you come on up?
Thank you very much, Jim. And we'll take some questions from the audience, and I want to ask an initial question to kind of spark the conversation. I'd be very interested from Bill and James to hear some reflections, especially given Jim's readings. And it seems to me that, at least on the Carson and here in our community in northern New Mexico, that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity with the forest planning process, but we also face a multi-generational challenge in terms of forest management, given pressing issues such as, in particular, climate change. So I'd love to hear reflections in that context and in the context of Jim's comments today in the film. Why don't we start with Bill, and then we'll work our way down.
Oh, my.
Put you on the spot, Bill.
I thought that was great, Jim. Thank you. Enjoyed the readings very much and the video as well, and it really points toward a collaborative model rather than a procedural model coming up with our approaches to our public lands. I'll tell you, the history of public lands in America has been one of continuously changing goals all through our history. And that video talked about one period of rapid revision. We have periods of rapid revisions and slow revision, but it's always changing. And I've been really disturbed this winter, as many of you have, I'm sure, by the events at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. The political fracturing of American society is being felt with our public lands. The state of Utah, its legislature, which is compared to which the New Mexico legislature looks like the Athens of Pericles. The Utah legislature just approved legislation a couple of months ago, or a month ago, to sue the federal government for title to the public lands, including the national forests within Utah. And it even appropriated, I don't know, $3.5 million of the expected $14 million it would need for this. We're in a kind of crisis about what we as a people think, what we agree on about our public lands. And it's not just national forests, it's wildlife refuges, it's BLM. And I think we're begun in, and I hope it turns out all right, I'm not too sure it will, a major nationwide revision of our view of public lands. And I think I don't want to hog the microphone, but we're just getting into it. And it's going to be big and complicated, and an enormous amount is at stake. And I would just offer this one thing, this one idea, that as the dark side argues for more and more privatization of what is today public, those of us who value those public lands need to think about the fact that they are part of what makes us Americans. That the possession of public lands, the long history of public lands, is central to our national experience and our identity. And I think, Jim, books like yours are going to help. We need more, and we need vocal leadership from our highest level is in the federal government to articulate a vision about what our public lands truly should be and can be now in the 21st century. We're behind the curve and we're really challenged.
All right, well, thank you, Jim, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. You know, I guess the video really does hit home, even though it takes place in a different ecosystem. It very much is a story of resiliency, right? And I think that's something that as New Mexicans, when we think of our recent experience here, we've been dealing with drought for a very long time. We've been dealing with wildfire, you know, for the last decade or so. Really intense wildfire, and those are things that really get the attention of the community, that really make us think about what's going on here, what is Mother Nature, what's happening. You know, if our regional forester, Cal Joyner, was here tonight, he would talk about that vision, and that vision is very clear in our southwestern region, which is New Mexico and Arizona. And it is a vision of restoration and community engagement. We view the Carson National Forest as this is a community forest. These are your public lands. We're stewards, and the Forest Service, the Carson National Forest, our employees are very committed to shared stewardship and those opportunities to really come together as a community as a whole to really figure out, you know, how do we come together and do what's right for the land and balance these needs and these uses out. It's a challenge. It's not easy. It's a great challenge to all of our Forest Service employees, and here in the Carson we have an awesome workforce of folks that are very passionate and committed to not just the land and the science, but they're also committed to the community. And I think that's something that I'm really excited about. You talked about the forest plan and where the Northwest was. You know, it's perfect timing because, as you mentioned earlier, we're right in forest plan revision, right? And what is plan revision? Well, probably in the 1980s when our last forest plan was produced, it was very much a document that was focused on outputs. And it spoke to how much timber are we going to produce and how many acres of certain things are we going to get done and this, that, and the other. But now it's more about really outputs, you know, and outcomes, I should say. And what do we want as a community? It's not necessarily about certain amounts of board feet. It's really about that balance and that outcome that we want as a community. So that's something that is a big change right now in our agency and the directives that we're using with our planning rule. We've realized as an agency, and again, you know, the agency has a long history. We obviously have made mistakes. We've learned from those mistakes, and one of the things that we realized is we're only successful if the community's engaged and involved, right? Because planning is one thing, implementing together and being on board with that is another thing. We're in a little different scenario down here in the Northwest. Timber receipts do allow for that funding source because we can all come up with great ideas, great plans, but it really comes down to how are we going to fund this work, right? There's a lot of great restoration work. We're pretty fortunate, and even though there's parts of New Mexico, and I will share with you that I just came to the Carson from Otero County, down in Alamogordo, which is a county that views the world very similarly as our neighbors in Utah. You know, they feel very passionately. I used to have conversations with county commissioners about their desire to make National Forest System lands private and the value, you know, the reasons behind that. We're in a little different scenario here in Taos County and Rio Vivo County, and I think that's a really great thing. But the state of New Mexico, nonetheless, is putting more money than ever on our public land, on federal land, on Forest Service land. We work very closely with the Game and Fish, State Forestry, and it's a really nice environment right now in northern New Mexico where all the agencies are coming together to do what's right for the community. It's new, not saying it's perfect, but it's exciting, and I just want to assure you that this is a great time for the community to come together and really identify, just like those working groups were doing, what is our plan? And it's not a Forest Service plan. It may be labeled that, and I might sign that, but it's really a community plan. And I think that's the way we're approaching plan and vision. So I would share that.
Well, thank you.
Question? Oh, Bill.
One thing, we talk about goals. And as James just brought up, money keeps coming into it. Today, I believe the Forest Service has half as many employees working on forest management as it had in 1991. The budget has shifted more and more to fire for obvious reasons because of what we've called the forest health crisis and so forth, and the kinds of catastrophic fires that we've had. And there's a kind of tragedy here, an irony. Now that we've learned some of the lessons that are in your book and in the video that we just saw, we don't have the resources we used to have for proactive management. And the table is tipping, climate change. I mean, certain views from here, you could look southwest to the Jemez Mountains and see that the Jemez, the entire eastern side of the Jemez, the entire eastern Jemez, ponderosa, and mixed conifer forest, it's gone. Gone. Las Conchas, Cerro Grande, Oso Complex, Dome, a few other fires, and that resource is pretty well gone. That's kind of a signal of what lies ahead with a warming environment for even the asbestos forest of the Carson. So I just want to throw that up there too.
You know, one thing that was very interesting about the video was where you were discussing, you know, the media not necessarily wanting to cover the story, right? And that's a challenge for the Forest Service. We usually have these kind of conversations when there's something wrong, right? And there's frustration in the community, and that happens every so often, and that's going to continue to happen in the future. But there's a lot of things that are really going right. We have a lot of awesome projects, great collaboration and landscape scale restoration going on right now, fish structures, fish habitat improvement, really great partnerships with folks that are very committed to the resource. But unfortunately, we never get the opportunity to really share that story, right? So we think a lot about that as an agency, and you know, in fact, we talked about that today. How do we get that word out? I guess that's the ask that I have for this group, is we need your help to get that message out. You know, I would ask you to help us to recognize when we're failing and where we may need to improve in a way that's helpful, but also I would ask you to really give us some feedback and make sure that you're sharing those stories of success, because that's really important to the Forest Service, to our community, and to those Forest Service employees. You know, and I think if I could ask everybody one thing is, you know, if you see a Forest Service employee doing something that is in your mind valuable, let them know that, because you spoke of a time where rangers were frustrated and you know, it wasn't necessarily the funnest place to work. There are still those places in the agency. This is a great place to work. I think we're very fortunate to be here in northern New Mexico, but it's not an easy job. But our folks are very committed, and I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, James. Questions for the audience?
I'm not from here, forgive me if I'm politically incorrect here, but elections matter. And I'd like to hear from Jim on this, because I think a lot of this story tonight came about because the Clinton administration brought in Jack Ward Thomas to head up the Forest Service, a biologist, or wildlife biologist, whose research was on the spotted owl. Yeah. When he left, Mike Dombeck came in to head up the Forest Service. They didn't just get there, they were asked by that administration. He was a fisheries biologist, had his PhD in fisheries, and I got to know him very well because I was chief of the Soil Conservation Service, brought in, and then Natural Resources Conservation Service. Molly Beatty was brought in to head up Fish and Wildlife. She was a forester by training, but had a real focus on wildlife. And when we get together every time we got together, we tried to outdo each other in quoting Alva Leopold. Now, I don't know if we'll ever have a group of administrators of our natural resources agency. And of course, Bruce Babbitt was part of all of that as well. It was an exciting time. When I came into the Soil Conservation Service, our agency was not allowed to use the word environment out of the Reagan administration. I mean, we had a big job to do, and we still do, of course, as you know. But I think pay attention to that, whether it be your state legislature or your those you send to Washington. It makes a big difference. And
Okay.
you're a product of that.
I tend to agree, especially more now than before. It made a huge difference when the Forest Service was being birthed. You know, Teddy Roosevelt had a vision and really committed to that, created national forests and Forest Service, and that was such a halcyon days of, you know, conservation. In many ways, I think a lot of people would articulate the idea that the Forest Service was somewhat immune from politics during the 60s and 70s. We had a lot of, when longevity was more important in the Senate then than it is today. There was a block of Western senators, both Democratic and Republican, who were very pro-industry and pro-logging, and really took care of the Forest Service. And it tended to aid and abet the desires of the Forest Service to manage their national forest primarily for timber production. A lot of that began to change. I would say with the emergence of the environmental movement, combat started in earnest in the 80s. So when Clinton came in, I would say he was the first president who I think really determined that he was going to bend the arc of the Forest Service as an agency. And I'm sure to a degree other agencies as well. But for us who lived in the Forest Service, it was very evident that big changes were afoot. So for example, the protection of 58 million acres of roadless area, 2% of the United States, would have never happened in a Republican administration. After Clinton left office and Bush was elected, that Republican administration tried in earnest to undo those protections. Ultimately, the fate of those roadless protections fell on the courts, and it was a long slog, but I felt that the efforts that I was involved in were ultimately vindicated by the courts after years of tumultuous legal struggles in many different places. So these things do make a difference. Now, after Bush, Obama came in. Probably won't mention any names, but I will mention one senior staff with the Council on Environmental Quality who had served through numerous Republican and Democratic administrations, dating back to Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush. Her comment upon the arrival of the Obama administration was, "Jim, you will be disappointed in the lack of an agenda for public lands with this administration, even though they're Democratic. They seem to have a singular focus on energy and energy policy, and public lands don't seem to matter. I don't think you're going to see any major initiatives with respect to national forests, BLM lands, national parks, et cetera." I have found those words to be somewhat prophetic. So now we have another election coming up, and I would say the contrast between a Democratic president and a Republican president are even more profound than they were 20 years ago. And so they will have dramatic consequences. And I know that some of the Republican candidates are already on record as saying that they support privatization of public lands, as Bill was talking about. So we'll see. I live in Washington, D.C. still, and it's a wild season back there. And it's a fascinating time to be alive in America. A little scary too.
Other questions? Well, we'll do it in, you're standing, you can go first, then you in the red shirt, you can go second. First up at the top. You were standing already.
Oh, me?
Yeah, go for it.
I have two questions, one kind of general, and both for James. Could you talk a little more about the Carson revision plan in regard to the kind of collaborative model that was demonstrated in the video? That's the first question. And then the second question, more specifically, has to do with privatization and wilderness. And we have a lot of money and a lot of energy coming up into the Taos Ski Valley, which is the closest neighbor to the Wheeler Peak Wilderness. And the intersection of those two things happening is kind of, gives me pause to wonder what the future holds for that particular little wilderness area. And then the question is, what is the Forest Service doing anything in terms of interfacing with the ski valley or setting up any kind of collaborative planning with the community to talk about the expansion and what the impact might be on the wilderness area, which is in kind of a fragile state at this point?
Okay, so I think I can answer both questions with one answer, because it really is tied to our forest plan revision. And when we talk about plan revision, it's a long process. Last year around this time, we were working on our assessment, which is essentially what is this existing condition and status of the Carson National Forest, and we finished that work. He did an excellent job. And then in October, we issued our notice of intent to begin forest plan revision, right? So that's all procedural stuff, but nonetheless, with this new calendar year, we began really talking about forest planning, and a lot of forest plan revision is just getting going. So this is perfect timing for you all to really get involved and get engaged. We're taking an interesting approach, and again, going back to, the plan is only valuable if we all understand it and we all support it when we're done, right? So we're working with key stakeholders, key government groups. We feel like that's key. We've elected officials, whether they're mayors of towns or county commissioners, folks like that. We have state governments involved, a lot of our partners, our sister agencies, our state agencies. Those are stakeholders that are very, very key to our working group. And so we have a working group that's very similar. It's just formed. It includes our tribal governments and all those forms of governments. Now, how do we involve the general public? Well, we have our general public sessions, and you will see in the near future discussions that are very focused on the public, the communities coming together to further that conversation about what is your connection with the land, and two, what do you see as the need for future management going forward. And this is going to be very collaborative and interactive, and it's going to be a difficult conversation because many community members have different needs, right? And it's really a challenge to come together as a group and balance out those needs. So that's the approach. What I've offered to groups is we try hard as an agency to really bring people to the table and have that conversation. The most difficult challenge we have is just getting people to show up and be engaged. So that's where we need help. And if there's groups that get together very often, whether they're working groups that are already established, we're very willing to come out and talk to those groups that are interested and very passionate about forest management, and host sessions that allow you to be involved and understand our process. So that's how we're working through that. The wilderness piece is a little bit interesting because forest plan revision requires us to assess through a collaborative process again, and we just started this process. It's assessing lands that have wilderness characteristics, really figuring out where is the right mix of wilderness, based on the needs of the communities. Once we're done with that assessment, we will come forward with a recommendation, right? And that's essentially what forest plan revision will do, is it'll come forward with a recommendation that says, look, these are the lands that really make sense for this landscape for wilderness. Now, wilderness, the designation, the authority to designate wilderness really is at Congress. So our role as the managing agency is to make that recommendation, and then Congress can take that whatever direction that they want. Now, aside from that, that's our process for wilderness and wilderness recommendations. But we all know that there's a lot of discussion over wilderness right now in this community, whether it's the Pecos expansion and some of the other proposals that are out there. Congress can engage in conversations separately outside of the agency and make decisions, and we as the managing agency will support whatever decision Congress comes down with. So that's the way we've been approaching the wilderness piece, and I would share that the next phase of the wilderness is our wilderness assessment phase, which is really digging into what do we think is the right mix of wilderness. When we think of the needs of the communities, whether it's wood, areas that need firewood, sustainable watersheds, wildlife habitat, water quality, water yield, all these things, when we think of that as a community, what is the right mix of wilderness? And that's the challenge that we all have as a community, is to put that map together. So that's the next phase, and you will be seeing meeting invites for that.
The gentleman in the red plaid shirt.
So I thought that the part of the movie that was particularly impressive was getting the context right when you started thinking about the forest and its health. And I don't really think that we can think about public lands and forests and so forth realistically unless we get the context right. And the context is bigger, and global warming is a horrible thing that's rolling toward us. And I live up at 8,600 feet my entire life's been a kind of gradual journey from inner city Chicago to 8,600 feet up in the mountains. And every summer I lay there thinking about, well, when is the fire going to come? You know, it's going to come. And when is it going to come? So when you guys sit around talking about the kinds of things that we're talking about tonight, can you be successful, really, in having that discussion unless you take on this other problem? Hard problem. You know, I've got this thing about the nihilism light, you know, I mean, nobody in this room is a denialist, I'm pretty sure. But there's another kind of denialism, and it's the one that we just don't want to think about. It's too hard to think about. It really is. You know, it makes it hard for every single one of us. So what are we going to do?
Okay, so let me start by taking you briefly back to the Pacific Northwest, and then I want to come to New Mexico. I came to the conclusion that reducing the national forest, the Sayulita National Forest, to a complex of old clear cuts that would live to 70 years old and then clear cut them again was just short-sighted, wrong, unsustainable, and just inappropriate for that magnificent landscape that is capable of growing some of the largest living organisms on Earth and home to the most spectacular forests on Earth. And to see that landscape largely reduced to, you know, plantations, I just found it really troubling. So we set about to change that. And we were motivated also by circumstances, true. So now you come to northern New Mexico, you see these things happening. Yes, it's a huge problem because some of these forces, climate change, drought, catastrophic fire, are so huge that they almost defy human management and control. I will say, given the choice, I tend to want to opt for diversity, as diverse landscapes as possible. And so you might say, well, we got a lot of PJ around here, or we have a lot of ponderosa pine, and that's true. But even within those ecotones, one can manage for diversity, and I think that is the springboard for a resilient landscape that Bill DeBuise mentioned. And I really don't know what's going to happen in the next 100 years. I think we're in for a bumpy ride. But I just hope that the Forest Service can rise to this immense challenge to address to the best of their ability these forces that are moving our way inexorably. It's huge, it's a big job, and we got to do it, and there are a lot of troubling things. You know, Bill mentioned, and James is all too aware of this, the reduction in staffing, the reduction in budget, the increase in fire costs. All these factors make it more complex. But we just have got to find a way. And I would say when I sat and stared into almost like what I call the void of the future, 20 years ago, I couldn't have pictured things being this good. And yet I look back now, and I'm both relieved and gratified and overjoyed that things are doing so well out there on the Oregon coast. And so I would challenge you is don't despair, hang on to hope, think 20 years from now what you want this country to look like, and then begin to cobble together the solutions and building blocks to help you get there. And I think James is saying he's willing to let the owners back into the room. I think he's anxious for that help, your insights, your innovation, your ideas, and get there together. It can work.
I'd actually like to ask a question of Bill in particular, who I know through your writing and storytelling has asked this question of how do you manage and think about despair? You know, I have 2 young boys that I brought into this world, and I want to leave them with something. I mean, how do you engage in that conversation?
I've been thinking about it a lot because it's really hard. The gentleman talked about different levels of denial. Everybody in this room accepts that climate change is a reality, but can we really accept? I mean, in philosophy, I think one of the most interesting questions ever asked was Socrates asked of Alcibiades, do you assent to what you know? Do you assent to what you know? Well, we know a lot about climate change, but have we really thought it through? If you read the literature, really powerful paper by Park Williams, who used to be over at Los Alamos, now is at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, part of Columbia University. His paper would tell us that the forests of northern New Mexico, 20 years from now, no matter what we say we want the forest to be, we won't have very many alternatives. By 2050, according to his forest drought severity index, a very complex algorithm basically that he developed, conditions in our forests here in 2050 will be as bad as the worst conditions in the archaeological dendrochronological record, which is to say region-wide broad-scale forest destruction, die-off, whether it's beetles or fire, it doesn't really matter. We're going to see huge changes here. And that's one of the reasons I think we really need to refigure this business of what are our public lands for. In a way, our public lands can buffer our uncertainty. That's not appropriate for a soundbite, but we don't know much about what the future in detail is going to hold. But as long as we have public lands, we have more possibility for futures to play out that we can work with. Not that we can manage. Forget manage. Maybe we can nudge. We're going to be a culture of nature nudgers in the future, I think, at best. But I'll tell you this, and this is the most important thing I've learned in the last decade or so from a couple of different writing enterprises. I'm going to quote somebody else. A.B. Guthrie said, "The older I get, the more my mind dwells on the wonder and beauty of nature." And if you think about the beauty of Earth, if you think that complexity is part of beauty, I'm going on too long, but if you think complexity is part of beauty, then all the DNA here on this planet makes Earth the most beautiful thing in the universe. It's almost mathematical. And the miraculous thing about the beauty of Earth is that even as it erodes, and we erode it pretty fast, pretty heavily, it remains inexhaustible for all practical purposes because it is so abundant, this beauty. And so I think that what I would say to kids is that any action that you can take to defend the beauty of Earth, and Earth will always, its beauty will always need defense, any action you can take is a good action and a meaningful action. And meaning trumps hope. I hate to use that word, actually. But meaning trumps hope. So in a way, it doesn't matter whether what we hope for is going to come about. What really matters is what we're going to do next. I'll leave it there.
Well, that's actually a wonderful transition. I'm reframing the question a little bit for James in terms of what we do next. And thinking, I know you grew up in northern New Mexico, you're a native Norteños, and thinking about what kind of opportunities, given the intersection between people and the forest, which is a strength, but also creates tensions in northern New Mexico. I'd love to hear where there are possible pathways forward to find that kind of meaning.
Well, I think we're in an interesting time right now because, you know, people are concerned. We have wildfires, drought. We thought we were looking good with some of the moisture. Now this wind has us thinking about the drought really gone, right? So it has a lot of forest users thinking about how do I sustain my use and my connection with the land. And I think that's what's bringing us all together. When we completed our assessment, one of the things that we found that is the common ground that brings us all together to the table is water. And you know, what's our water future like? Water security and just water quality here is really, really important. Whether you're, you know, a developer, you're an Acequia user, whether you're a fisherman and you really support fish habitat, water is important. So I think there's some common themes that we as community members just need to talk about and are willing to sit down and invest our time in. So I think that's a really great opportunity right there, is to start that conversation. But you know, like you shared, I'm very open to ideas. I don't think the Forest Service has a plan, you know, that we're just waiting to pop out of a shelf and share with the community. I think we're really asking the community to help us with this. And you know, where are these working groups? Where do we meet? We're asking communities that. How do we even host meetings that are effective meetings? Because we don't want to just waste time. We have limited resources, and that is a reality. We are short-staffed, and we have slim budgets. So how do we be effective as a community? And I think that's where we can really use your help to really have the most valuable conversations. Because what it really comes down to is our landscapes, like you described, they're not at a good state right now. And I think our goal as an agency is to make them more resilient. And kind of going back to your question, what are we going to do? We have to prioritize. We can't treat it all. You know, landscape scale restoration is tough to even plan and you know, get in your mind. But really, when you start thinking about, okay, how are we going to actually implement this? That's a challenge, and that's a challenge to all of us, industry included. So I think that's something that we just need to sit and think about: is how do we plan it and implement it together as a community, and what is realistic? Because we're not going to be able to treat it all, so we have to prioritize those areas that are most valuable and maybe most worthy of protecting. And I think when we think about plans, the other valuable process in our planning process, in our forest plan revision process, is it also includes other plans. So you know, the county has great plans. Community wildfire protection plans have been put together by the county to really assess wildfire risk and community risk, and you know, how do they mitigate that? Because we're all in this together. You know, we are the agency that tends to lead the charge when we're responding to wildfire suppression. But you know, we don't need to wait till the wildfire to really start doing things that are wise, fire wise. So there's a lot of things as homeowners that we can all do to prepare, as a community that we can do to prepare. And I think that's where you know, the community coming together just to have that discussion is really, really valuable to us as a Forest Service.
We have time for a few more questions. Up in the back first.
Yeah, I really like what you were saying, Bill, about Malheur and then also about meaning trumping hope. And I feel like there's been such success over creating fear, using that name again, which I won't, but that people respond, you know, the fear of losing certain rights, the fear of the loss of some kind of bizarre American dream that is being expressed, let's say, by these militia folks. But I'm looking for what's the answer then? How do we tell that story, recreate that name again of what public lands mean to the American cultural myth. I think that's what we need to be working on defining, because, and also to some extent, perhaps, figuring out what fears people have that might bring, I hate to use that, bring us together behind our public lands.
I think that's a great question, and I wish I had the answer. One of the most discouraging things about the Malheur business is that those folks seized the narrative about public lands.
Exactly.
They defined the discussion. What's our counter argument? What should be the other narrative? And how do we get it out there? You know, I think there were elements of it in the video and in the passages that Jim read, but there's more still to add to that. And but how do you get it to cohere in something that, in a sense, is maybe not newsworthy but myth-worthy? You know, that will stick with people and stay with them. I really don't know. I really am thinking about it a lot, but I'm not there. But I think you've put your finger on exactly the right question to be asking.
Up at the back.
My name's Mark Schutz. In response, this is a great segue. First, let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm a member of the Taos County Community Wildfire Protection Plan Core Team that Mr. Duran was talking about. I'm also a member of the Taos Valley Watershed Coalition, organized to address landscape scale restoration, specifically in the Southwest Forest and in the Carson and Taos County forests. What we're talking about is there are just way too many trees, and we haven't said that specifically. I think it's interesting that in perhaps the wettest forest in the United States, they addressed their problem the same way. They reduced their stand stocking and made it more diverse. That's why we're having catastrophic fires like the Jemez. It was all a contiguous stand of trees that were all arguing for a limited amount of water, where historically there were a dozen or 15 trees per acre with a grass stand underneath. So I'm also a forest thinner. I have a forest thinning company, and we do land restoration in the valley too. I think of myself, and the answer is, it's partly in a great book, 1491, which describes a people on this continent who felt themselves to be an intrinsic participating component of natural systems and interacted dynamically with them. I think that is the answer, Bill, to the what's the alternative narrative besides it's mine, it's yours. Fundamentally, the argument is over a completely diminished resource that would benefit tremendously from efforts that have taken place in Taos County by organizations like the Rocky Mountain Youth Corps, which is cultivating youth who understand the imbalance of vegetation condition and are directly participating in its healing by stand reduction, soil stabilization, and water infiltration. I don't know if I said this already, but it's been going around in my mind for a while, so I'm going to take a chance. I feel myself to be part of a growing and increasing land restoration economy, which has huge potential. Before I forget, I want to say that those organizations I described, we are carrying a list of 27 potential funding sources to address forest improvements and forest resiliency here. What we lack, we all have jobs we have to go to, and these fundamental demands for sleep and food, which take up time, I'm sure. And so, and we're working as directly as we can with the agencies, and small efforts have been made through collaborative efforts that look very much, when I looked at your film this morning on the web, and my eyes moistened, because that's the crux of it. People freely, in collaboration, consensus-based negotiation about what shall we do, working with James and the agencies. Fantastic opportunity, but you need dollars. And you folks in the Northwest, you have a fast-growing forest that produces dollars. We have a slower-growing forest that, if folks remember from a couple of, maybe less than a month ago, thinned areas in Taos Canyon we're growing the ponderosa pine trees twice as fast as unthinned areas. So we have here we'd be growing, if we reduced our stand density and improved our site conditions with, that's a longer discussion, facilitating soil stabilization and water infiltration, we could grow trees 2 or 3 times faster. We could get to the point where our forest could support the continuing restoration that's needed, but we need a jump start, and that comes back to those grants that I'm just talking about. That's the fundamental mechanism we've used in the area over the last 10 years, in addition to stimulus money that came down from Obama. I just want to invite anyone who's here, anyone who you know, please contact me or the Taos County Community Wildfire Protection Plan 14. Get on our mailing list, come to our meetings. Maybe someone you know has a little spare time and can help sort through these funding opportunities, help do a little research. It's fundamentally all just about an investment of time and interest, and money can come. We've had success using employing those values. And I guess lastly, I've taken a lot of time, but I'm so in the middle of this. I just lastly want to say, in a cheery response to global warming, bring it on, because biological processes moderate climatic extremes. My view is that we just need to tune up our biological processes. The carbon surplus in the atmosphere is partly due to burning, but it's hugely due to we do not have a healthy ecosystem almost anywhere on the earth, because it's been treated extractively rather than reciprocally. So, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe one final question.
I'd like to, I think the future of the Forest Service and public lands depends a lot on a keyword, balance. If we can, I think if we get out of balance, the film points out we're out of balance in one way. If we keep going the way we are, we're liable to get out of balance in the opposite direction. And that tends to alienate people, communities, jobs. I think the key thing for the Forest Service, and especially in our Carson plant, is to find a way to really come up with a balance between environmental benefits, which we stated very clearly, timber, energy, forest products, grazing, recreation, pretty much all of the above. I think the key word is we need to keep a balance. If we're not in balance, we need to head towards a balance. And in fact, that has, somebody mentioned the political ramifications. This is political, and will be political.
It's interesting, I would say that you're always looking for evidence of that balance. Once you articulate a certain vision, how do you determine whether it's in balance or not? And I've been really intrigued on the Siuslaw National Forest, which used to be a hotbed of controversy and contention, litigation, appeals, all this kind of thing. They have not had an appeal or a lawsuit in 20 years. So to me, it's a different regime, but I think they have struck a balance that resonates with people much more harmoniously than the past. Now, it might have gotten by you unless you're listening very closely, but this thinning regime that they're doing is going to run its course in another 20 years. They clear cut for 40 years. We're going to thin the clear cuts for 40 years, and then what? Okay? These are the hard questions they need to ask is, okay, then they will have gone through this restoration regime, and then there's going to be a new future beckoning. And finding that new vision and balance when that day comes. And I've talked with Jerry Ingersoll a number of times about this. I said, Jerry, don't wait another 20 years. Start that discussion now. Be thinking that far ahead that you're ready for that day when it arrives. So, yeah, but good comments. I appreciate that. There ought to be some way to measure or feel the balance when it's there.
James, Bill, any final thoughts?
Well, one thing that I would share is you're right, that's what it's all about, right, is balancing and really committing to that. There is no such thing as perfect, right, and I think that's our role as stewards of the land, and I think, we're very committed to shared stewardship so that we're working together to counterbalance, if you will, and manage, and give the landscape, the opportunity to to thrive. You know, we talk about potential natural. That's a term that we use, and I think what we're hoping to do is really treat the landscape in a way that it's moving towards its potential, right? You know, we also are interested in using every tool that's out there, and as we talk, there's new tools being developed and industries talking, and that's a really exciting time, and I think we're open to a lot of things, but it's really gonna take the community to be open and really consider change. We talk about climate change, but it's gonna take change in management as well, and that's a change in how we are used to seeing the National Forest manage. The film there saw some work that looks very disruptive, you know, the riparian, the trenching, the riparian, but you know, it's all about those longer term goals and working towards that long-term potential natural. Prescribed fire, you know, we live in an ecosystem that needs fire, and not all fire is bad. High intensity fire is not good, but there is prescribed fire that can put low intensity prescribed fire out there. We have the folks that know how to do that. We're very committed to interagency cooperation where we're burning across boundaries. This is something that's really exciting. We're, you know, constantly talking to the tribes and other landowners, BLM, private landowners, with the NRCS and other agencies to figure out how do we treat the landscape. Because you know, nature knows no boundaries of ownership, right? And we're all in this together as a community. So this is a really exciting time, and I think I am optimistic that we can do it. It's not going to be easy, and I know at some point we will hit some roadblocks and maybe even fail a time or two. But I do think that there will be some positive outcomes as a community, and I'm very thankful to be a part of that.
Two quick thoughts. One is in terms of management. We stand a danger of managing to preserve things as they are now, and we don't really get that option. I think we need to take to heart what I call the Gretzky principle. They say Wayne Gretzky was a great ice hockey player, not because he skated to where the puck was, but to where it was going to be. So somehow we got to keep looking for where the puck is going to be and manage toward something that is reasonable and fits with that. The other thing is that here in northern New Mexico, we have such a remarkable cultural tradition or twining of traditions. One of the few rosy aspects of the Malheur occupation was the position of the Burns Paiute tribe.
Yeah.
And they said, we want those people out of there. We like the National Wildlife Refuge because it protects our heritage. Well, whether you're Taos Indian or Hispano from northern New Mexico, or like most of us in this room, part of the continuing invasion of 1846, we all have some kind of heritage tied up in the public lands. And I think this is one of the challenges for the Forest Service, but one of those challenges that is really an opportunity to find a way, to find the narrative that honors all the heritages together and allows the people to rally around this great gift we have, this lovely thing, the public lands of northern New Mexico. And if there is that connection to the land, then maybe we'll get lucky and muddle our way through the actual nitty-gritty of living through an era of change.
Well, it's a wonderful way to end tonight's discussion. I will say as an observation that these are questions that we struggle with every day at Western Environmental Law Center, and as one of the catalysts for what had happened on the Sayus Law and more broadly nationally on Forest Service lands, we're thinking about what our role is in developing legal frameworks and the way that we increasingly think about laws is simply as codification of how we should relate to each other. What are our relationships as human beings? How should we function effectively together? And I love the Wayne Gretzky story. It's one that's actually driven some of our strategic thinking as an organization, and I know with partners like Amigos Bravos. It will be a very interesting future with our forests, especially as they get integrated into our communities even more closely. And James didn't go into this, and it's a little wonky, but the way the conceptual framework for the Forest Service is focused on sustainability, but it talks about ecological sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability all working together, going to that question of balance and trying to create a framework. Mark, what you had suggested before in terms of the restoration, how do we create a framework for restoration and for a land-based economy reflective of community values? That's easy for us to do. I'm sure Mark will have stories about how difficult it is to get some of these projects through, and I'm sure James knows how difficult it is to get approval for projects going through various processes. So with that, I want to thank very much our panelists, Bill Dubuis, James Duran, and in particular Jim Furnish for his wonderful novel and for sparking this conversation in Taos. So thank you very much, all of you.